In 1918, America's air power only amounted to a modest machine called the Airco DH.4. To power it, officials rushed to assemble an engine for a mission that had never existed before, creating a machine so unstable that even while flying at barely 124 miles per hour with little more than 300 pounds of bombs, it had a nasty habit of exploding mid-air. Pilots named it the Flaming Coffin, and America was taking it to war. In April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson had a difficult decision to make. For almost 3 years, America had managed to stay out of the conflict that had already ravaged most of Europe. But if the commander-in-chief didn't step up now, the war could soon reach the nation's borders. Germany had promised to keep its submarines on a leash, yet just last March, the merchant ship SS Vigilancia had been struck without warning by a torpedo from U-70 as she sailed across the North Atlantic, despite the neutrality marks across her hull. And pressure wasn't coming only from the seas. Just recently, the president had received worrisome news from Britain. A captured message from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann, addressed to the German ambassador in Mexico City, revealed that Germany was seeking Mexico's support for a campaign against the United States. America had to go to war. There was just one small problem. The country didn't have a war-ready air force. By 1917, the United States had only about 137 aircraft under its command, none of them considered powerful enough to go toe-to-toe with the Germans in the skies. The Curtiss JN-4, considered one of the most notable American aircraft of the World War I period, was not even designed to carry a single gun, let alone a bomb. By contrast, as early as 1916, Germany had already put the Gotha G4 heavy bomber into the air, one of the largest combat aircraft built up to that point. With an impressive 77-foot wingspan, it could carry bomb loads exceeding 1,000 pounds and mount up to 3 machine guns, allowing her crew to defend themselves while striking targets far below. There was simply no way around it. The United States was outmatched in the air. Yet with threats closing in from every direction, there was no time to sit down and design the aircraft that would win the war. The best America could do was assemble a team tasked with crossing the Atlantic, reviewing the aerial arsenals of the Allied powers in Europe, and reporting back to command which model could be replicated in the United States the fastest. The unit was known as the Bowling Commission, and almost as soon as they touched down in Europe, they identified 4 candidates that could meet the requirements for America's first true warplane. The first was the French SPAD S-13 biplane fighter. It was a brand new model. In fact, it had taken its first flight just 2 days before the United States officially entered the First World War, on April 6, 1917. Armed with a Hispano-Suiza 8 engine, the aircraft could reach speeds of up to 131 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest fighters available to the Allies. That power, however, came at a price the Americans were not willing to pay. Despite their impressive technological design, the Hispano-Suiza engines were known for being temperamental. It wasn't uncommon for them to start shaking after only a few flights and refuse to deliver their full power. Officials even reported that at one point during the war, nearly 2/3 of the fleet had been grounded because of engine problems. The next candidate identified by the Bowling Commission was the SE-5, a British fighter designed by a group of aviation engineers working under the Royal Aircraft Factory. Aside from speed, the SE-5 was known for offering pilots excellent stability and respectable maneuverability, even at altitudes approaching 17,000 feet, where many German fighters struggled to operate without significant losses in performance. The main problem with this fighter, however, was obtaining the engines needed to power it. The British themselves struggled to obtain sufficient units to keep the aircraft operational. If the British couldn't fully rely on the aircraft they'd designed themselves, there was little reason to believe the Americans would fare any better, which is probably part of the reason why the Commission turned to its next contender, the Bristol F-2 fighter. The concept had real potential. It could carry up to 3 machine guns, haul a 240-pound bomb, and still reach speeds of roughly 123 miles per hour. But when the Americans saw the aircraft in action, they were far from impressed. During its first major combat mission in April 1917, a formation of 6 F-2s encountered 5 German Albatros D-3s, reportedly led by the Red Baron. 4 of the British aircraft were shot down, one after the other. the defeat was so devastating that it became part of what pilots soon began calling Bloody April. Still, the US needed an aircraft, and it needed it now. And so the Bowling Commission was forced to settle for its final option, a unit that hadn't even been designed to be a fighter. Its name was the Airco DH.4, and it was one of the earliest bombers assembled by Britain. It had been designed by Geoffrey de Havilland, who, despite not having established his own aerospace firm, was already one of the most respected names in aviation. An honor earned not only because of the aircraft he helped develop for the Royal Aircraft Factory in the years before the war, but also because of his own skill as a pilot. He'd actually taught himself to fly back in 1910, aboard one of his own creations, the FE-1, one of the earliest aircraft ever built. In just 4 years, he'd become accomplished enough to earn a commission as a lieutenant in the Royal Flying Corps. In other words, the man knew exactly what pilots needed when they were up in the sky, and he could turn those requirements into a fully realized machine. Rather than overcomplicating the design of his bomber with exaggerated wings, like the odd-looking German Gotha G4, or burdening the aircraft with heavy metal armor, like the Junkers J1, de Havilland kept the DH-4 simple. A standard two-seat configuration, built largely from plywood, light enough to carry up to 460 pounds of bombs, while still mounting enough guns to defend itself from attackers. Its true power, however, came from its speed. After a series of trials to find the ideal power plant, de Havilland finally settled on the Rolls-Royce Eagle 8 V12 engine, a powerhouse capable of producing up to 375 horsepower, giving the aircraft a top speed of roughly 143 miles per hour. In simple terms, even if the DH-4 couldn't carry a massive bomb load, there were very few enemy aircraft capable of stopping it from reaching its target once the bomber was seen approaching. And despite being designed primarily as a bomber, the DH-4 proved extremely flexible. The Royal Naval Air Service frequently used the aircraft for coastal patrols, and in some cases, pilots even used the onboard guns to engage an enemy aircraft directly. One of the most notable encounters came under the command of naval pilot Egbert Cadbury, who, after receiving word that a group of enemy Zeppelins was operating near his station, immediately took off to intercept them. According to reports, Cadbury jettisoned fuel and bombs to climb faster toward the massive airships, opening fire the moment he came within range. He later remembered, quote, "I attacked the Zeppelin ahead, slightly to the port, so as to clear any obstruction that might be suspended from the airship." It was a most fascinating sight, almost awe-inspiring, to see this enormous Zeppelin blotting out the whole sky above one. The tracers ignited the escaping gas, the flames spreading rapidly and turning the airship into a fireball in less than a minute. If America could achieve even half the success the DH-4 was showing on the battlefield, commanders would be satisfied. However, despite its many strengths, the bomber was not without flaws. Engineers knew they had to work fast. By mid-1917, the first American troops were already assuming battle positions in France, and until the US launched its own aircraft, these men would have to rely on Allied planes hovering overhead to keep the Germans at bay. To accelerate production, it was decided that several aerospace companies, including Dayton Wright, Boeing, and Fisher-Bodie, would join forces to assemble between 9,500 and 12,000 units of these bombers. Still, even with all this manpower, it would not be enough to get the DH-4 flying fast enough. By the first time the Bowling Commission returned to America, all they brought back for engineers to work with was a single DH-4, and even that wasn't the hardest part. With severe engine and part shortages across Europe, the Americans couldn't simply expect Airco to ship all the material they would need to get the bomber's production line rolling. Instead, they had to get creative, shifting configurations and testing different homegrown power plants that could get the DH-4 into the air. By the time the Americans produced an operational version of the aircraft, they'd implemented an estimated 1,000 changes to the original British design. Probably the most notable change was the swap from the powerful British Rolls-Royce Eagle 5.8 engine to the American Liberty L12. While still a respectable unit, ultimately capable of producing up to 400 horsepower, the Liberty engine had been assembled in a rush. Before the single bomber could dart down the runway, engineers had to spend considerable time ensuring it wouldn't quit on pilots mid-flight. And even when they did, there still wasn't much confidence that things wouldn't go wrong. Besides a somewhat experimental engine, the DH-4 also had an unreliable fuel system, which, as the National Museum of the United States Air Force explains, included a pressurized gas tank that, quote, had a tendency to explode and a rubber fuel line under the exhaust manifold, which caused some fires. On more than one occasion, troops on the ground witnessed the aircraft wrapped in flames as it came crashing to the ground, earning the bomber the unfortunate nickname the Flaming Coffin. To make flights aboard the American DH-4s even more tense, aside from dealing with exploding engines, the crew also had to face yet another safety hazard, one rooted in the aircraft's original design. While de Havilland's design was praised in many respects, it had long been noted that placing the main fuel tank between the observer and pilot was far from ideal. Not only did the separation make communication between the crew difficult during flight, but it also meant that if the aircraft crashed, the engine could potentially crush the pilot from behind. The configuration was so concerning that years later, engineers would redesign it in future variants. However, in 1917, there was no time to ensure the aircraft was completely safe. As long as it could fly, make a pass over German territory, and deliver a few effective strikes, that was considered good enough. And so, by mid-1918, after months of delays and last-minute modifications, the first batch of American-assembled DH-4s, now known by many as the Liberty plane, began arriving in France. The final version had lost a bit of the original bomber's power. Its total bomb payload had been reduced from 460 pounds to 322, and its maximum speed of 143 miles per hour had dropped closer to 124, largely due to the heavier Liberty engine. Still, the aircraft was nothing to scoff at. The bomber had been armed with two 30-caliber Marlin Rockwell M1917 machine guns in the front and two 30-caliber Lewis guns in the rear, each capable of firing roughly 400 rounds a minute. When an enemy position was beyond reach, the Liberty plane was also equipped with radio systems that allowed crews to guide fellow units onto the target. The aircraft's first operational missions finally arrived in August, and while the bomber may not have been the most advanced aircraft over the battlefield, it was the first American-built bomber to see combat, and its pilots were determined to make the most of it. The Liberty plane would go on to arm 13 Army Air Service squadrons, along with 4 Navy Marine squadrons operating near the Belgian coast. While the exact number of bombers assembled before the war ended is debated, some sources suggest around 4,800 were produced. Of that total, it's believed that between 1,213 and 1,885 were delivered to France, with around 700 of them going on to serve in the front lines. This was definitely not the colossal strike package the Americans had hoped for when they first began assembling the aircraft. For comparison, it's estimated that by the end of the war, the British Avro 504 would see nearly 9,000 units produced. Still, this was a nation that had only formally entered the aerial warfare game a few months earlier, and even if it had only a few hundred attackers under its wing, for America, it was a colossal leap, one that began paying off almost immediately. On October 8th, Marine Corps aviator Ralph Talbot spotted a formation of 9 enemy aircraft closing in on his group as they were in the middle of an air raid. The formation was too overwhelming to simply flee the scene. If Talbot was going to survive, he would have to put his DH-4 bomber into fighter mode. Taking a sharp turn, Talbot positioned his teammate, Gunnery Sergeant Robert G. Robinson, in a direct line to open fire with his Lewis guns. Shells streaked across the sky in both directions, flying close enough to the fuselage of the American DH-4 for the pilot to hear them buzzing past. At the time, battles like this were unlike anything pilots had ever experienced. There was no sophisticated combat doctrine for pilots to follow, no battle experience to guide their moves, as adrenaline surged when bullets started flying mid-air. Luckily for Talbot and Robinson that day, their luck held, and rather than becoming the latest victims of the Flaming Coffin, their Liberty plane's guns managed to shoot down one of its attackers before it could get them first. The airmen wasted no time in celebrating their victory, but instead took the opportunity to escape the area before the rest of the formation had a chance to avenge it. However, the ordeal was far from over. Not even a week had passed before another pack of enemy aircraft zeroed in on Talbot and Robinson's Liberty plane after it became separated from its main formation during a raid over Belgium. This time, they were facing a dozen attackers. Their only support was another Allied aircraft that had also become detached and their own guns. The odds didn't look good to begin with, and they only turned grimmer as the first bullets began to fly. Almost immediately, a round tore through Robinson's shoulder. Fighting through the pain, he tried to maneuver his weapon with his one good arm, but the guns wouldn't respond. The weapon had jammed. Talbot knew what he had to do. Pushing the Liberty engine to its limit, he opened the throttle and put as much distance as possible between his DH-4 and the attackers behind them, buying just enough time for Robinson to work on clearing the jam before banking back to face the enemy head-on. With his mind set on the enemy rather than the bullet in his shoulder, Robinson finally cleared the gun and opened fire on the attacking formation once again. However, before the American crew could land another hit, Robinson was struck by enemy fire a second time, one bullet in the hip, another in the stomach. Talbot tried to check on his gunner, but Robinson was no longer responding. With no other option left, Talbot pushed forward. Opening fire with his forward-facing guns, he managed to hit one of the enemy aircraft, blocking his path, tearing open a gap just wide enough for him to dive through as he attempted to escape. His bomber dropped to just 50 feet above the trenches, low enough that the guns of the troops below could easily reach him. Yet no shot struck the aircraft as Talbot crossed over enemy territory and raced toward the nearest hospital. He arrived just in time for Robinson's life to be saved. Before the month was over, however, Talbot himself would lose his life while flying aboard his DH-4. He was not a victim of enemy fire, but rather engine trouble that caused the bomber to crash shortly after takeoff. He'd achieved some of the most notable aerial victories by any American pilot during the war, but he was still flying the Liberty plane, and when you did, there was never any guarantee you would make it back to base, no matter how skilled you were, and no matter how well the bomber had served you in the past. Around the same time Robinson and Talbot were fighting for their lives in the skies, Army Lieutenants Harold Ernest Gettler and Irwin R. Bleckley were facing a battle of their own, aboard yet another American DH-4. Their mission would take them deep into the highly contested terrain of the Argonne Forest in northeastern France, not far from the Belgian border. Just days earlier, a unit of roughly 500 American soldiers had pushed into the area, unaware that the forces meant to guard their flank had become detached, marching straight into enemy territory, with no one to rely on if the operation went wrong. Now they were trapped, and the Germans were cutting them down by the dozens. Communication with the surrounding troops was nearly impossible, and earlier attempts to strike the enemy with artillery had only made matters worse, with some rounds falling dangerously close to the very men the Allies were trying to save. The only hope left was for Gettler and Bleckley to fly their DH-4 over the forest, not to drop bombs or chase enemy aircraft, but to fly low enough to drop supplies the trapped soldiers could use to survive until ground forces arrived to rescue them. It was one of the first combat airlift attempts in American military history. The pilots had no radar to warn them of incoming fire from concealed positions below, no reliable way to maintain communication with command while navigating the dense forest, and certainly not an engine powerful enough to guarantee a quick escape if the mission became dangerous. It's unclear exactly how many of these high-risk supply runs the men attempted in their DH-4. However, Air Force records suggest at least 2. During the initial one, the aircraft was met with such intense enemy fire that the crew struggled to deliver their packages into the intended drop zone. Some fell far from the trapped soldiers. Others may even have landed in the hands of the German troops trying to destroy them. Still, Gettler and Bleckley refused to give up. Not only did they return to the area, but this time they flew even lower, bringing their DH-4 close enough for German rifles and machine guns to easily track them. The American pilots had just begun dropping supplies when enemy fire struck the aircraft. The DH-4 plunged from the sky, crashing into the forest below and taking out both airmen. While the DH-4 resupply missions did not end in the way the pilots had hoped, they helped prove a concept that until then had been almost entirely theoretical, that bombers could support the war effort by delivering far more than payloads. A concept that, in the wars that followed, all forces around the world would take much further. In the end, the men of the so-called Lost Battalion would eventually be rescued, and as for Gettler and Bleckley, their sacrifice ultimately earned them both the Medal of Honor, becoming 2 of the very few American airmen to receive the decoration during the First World War. war ended just 4 months after the DH-4 began carrying out missions across the battlefield. By then, only about a third of the original production order had been completed, and roughly 7,500 pending aircraft were cancelled. Still, with more than 4,000 Liberty planes produced, the United States had enough aircraft in reserve that there was little reason to bring many of the bombers stationed in France back home. For many of the DH-4s that had served during the war, their careers ended shortly after the armistice. Large numbers of surplus aircraft were destroyed, alongside other outdated machines, in what later became known as the billion-dollar bonfire. Yet that fiery end would be far from the last chapter in the Liberty plane's story. In the post-war years, the aircraft continued serving in a wide variety of roles. DH-4s carried out dive-bombing attacks in Nicaragua, flew photographic patrol missions along the U.S.-Mexico border, and even served as aerial ambulances after some models were equipped with stretchers. The DH-4 also proved to be an exceptional experimental platform. Engineers continued refining their engines and propellers throughout the 1920s. These improvements eventually allowed pilot Jimmy Doolittle to complete a 21-hour flight from Jacksonville Beach, Florida to San Diego, California, one of the longest flights at the time. But the Liberty plane's story was not only about military service or record-breaking flights. After the war, the bombers set aside its weapons and found an unexpected new civilian career as a mail carrier. Trading bombs for letters, modified DH-4s could carry hundreds of pounds of mail in the forward cockpit where the observer once sat. Over time, the aircraft helped establish a transcontinental airmail network, connecting cities thousands of miles apart across the United States. Finally, in 1932, after nearly 15 years of service, the DH-4 was officially retired. By then, most of its technology had long since become outdated, but the legacy it left behind in American aviation would endure for decades. Not long after its retirement, a new generation of American bombers began to emerge. Among them was the B-17 Flying Fortress, a 4-engine giant capable of approaching 300 miles per hour and carrying up to 8,000 pounds of bombs, a dramatic leap from the roughly 300-pound payload the DH-4 could deliver. During World War II, America would push its bomber legacy even further with the arrival of the B-29 Superfortress. This 60-ton flying colossus would ultimately become the only aircraft in history to deliver nuclear weapons in wartime. A strike that only a few decades earlier would have seemed like the stuff of science fiction, yet which now could be delivered by a nation that not long before had entered its first modern war with barely enough aircraft to send into battle.